Welcome back, everyone. To conclude this series of lectures on The Portrait of a Lady, I want to pick up on two important structural features of the novel that we've already touched upon in passing, and that is the elements of time and space and how those are represented. And these both become more apparent as the novel reaches its midpoint, especially when readers discover in chapter 36, a few chapters into the book's second volume, that 3 full years have passed from Isabel Archer's marriage to Gilbert Osmond to where we now find her in the year 1876, ensconced in the Palazzo Roccanera in the eternal city of Rome. Other time gaps have advanced the narrative before this point, of course, but none of those have been as dramatically extended as this one is. In those other cases, we're told about Isabel's world travels, an extended visit by her sister and her nephews, and other incidents that apparently are not in need of any day-to-day reportage or close examination. The novelist, after all, has not set out to document this young woman's history as a mere record of facts, but to focus his energies on crucial stages of developments and decisive choices made by Isabel, incidents that lead to conflicts, and so on and so forth. It's part of the novelist's art not to bore the reader, but to arrange what can be fully dramatized and leave alone that which the reader may assume. The 3-year gap in volume 2 presents, however, a case that seems to exceed the more conventional use of such temporal ellipses, because presumably important events have occurred that we only hear about indirectly, well after the fact. We do not have an account of Isabel's engagement, for instance, nor her marriage ceremony. And perhaps most importantly, we know very little about her pregnancy, her giving birth, her brief period of motherhood, or the death of her infant son and its aftermath. What does it mean to leave these parts of Isabel's history to the reader's imagination? And more to the point, how do we understand this gap as an integral component in James's overall portrait? The facts of magazine serialization alone do not quite answer the question of why the author accelerates the time this way, although you may remember James's comment in the preface where he admits to the more leisurely pace of the novel's first half compared to its second. James, as other novelists of his time on both sides of the Atlantic, usually saw installments of their work already published in monthly magazines while still working on the new ones to come. Usually, as was the case with Charles Dickens and George Eliot, authors knew ahead of their contracts how many installments they would be needing and how many words each would have to be. In most cases, this was 12 installments, and both Dickens and Eliot were guided in their composition by these deadlines and word lengths. When Henry James sold the idea of The Portrait of a Lady simultaneously to Macmillan's magazine in Britain and the Atlantic Monthly in Boston, he negotiated for a less determinate number of installments, from 12 to 14. And this was a way of accommodating any expansion of the narrative that might arise as a necessity from the organic development of the text as he was writing it. He also did not write each installment as a self-contained dramatic unit, as other well-known novelists did, but had in mind the book's overall shape. He routinely asked friends not to read his latest work in serial form, but to wait until the series was published as a book, which would make a better reading experience. And these facts are more evidence of James's contention that a novel is a living thing, an organic form with its own internal aesthetic logic. Although we began talking about the symbolic significance of Rome in the novel, we did so in the context of its immediate suggestiveness as a place or a setting for this stage of Isabel's life and history. Other associations, other available meanings cling to this place as well, and they loom especially large in the imagination of 19th century Americans of a certain social class. Of course, worldliness is one of those associations that would strike provincial Americans almost immediately when they hear about Rome. At one point in human history, Rome was the known world, its imperial and cultural influence covering all of Europe, Northern Africa, and significant parts of Asia Minor. In a book of travel essays he wrote called Italian Hours, James offers this observation of what the Eternal City can offer to the tourist. He writes, "Nothing in Rome helps your fancy to a more vigorous backward flight than to lounge on a sunny day over the railing which guards the great central researches of the ongoing excavations of the Forum. It says more things to you than you can repeat to see the past, the ancient world, as you stand there, bodily turned up with the spade and transformed from an immaterial, inaccessible fact of time into a matter of soils and surfaces. The pleasure is the same in kind as what you enjoy of Pompeii, and the pain the same." Rome was also the deep past, the historical record of human civilization, the birthplace of a system of jurisprudence and governmental organization. In The Portrait of a Lady, as in other works by Henry James, Rome signifies the long, uneven, ever-layered accumulation of traditions, religious authority, civil engagement, and the cultivation of social politics that presented itself as alien, unfree, and unfathomable to young Americans like Isabel Archer and her literary predecessors, Daisy Miller and Christopher Newman, the protagonist of James's early novel, The American, where the city of Paris plays a similar role to that of Rome. In The Portrait of a Lady, all roads literally lead to Rome. Florence is fairly small and compact. It was the seat of the powerful Medici family, patrons of the art of Michelangelo, Brunelli, and Bernini, among others. Isabel's travels take her deeper into the world on a path that corresponds to her maturation over time, her transition from a certain cast of naive idealism to a cultivated sense of caution, skepticism, even calculation that she has been forced to acquire as a defense against the sporadic cruelty and intrusiveness of her husband, Gilbert. What I'd like to point out, however, is that the novel's consequential shifts in setting is paradoxically both an immersion of Isabel into the broader worldliness of Rome and her increasing isolation from the world. The palazzo she lives in with her husband is the emblem of that peculiar isolation, as we learn in this passage. She could live it over again, the incredulous terror with which she had taken the measure of her dwelling. Between those four walls, she had lived ever since. They were to surround her for the rest of her life. It was the house of darkness, the house of dumbness, the house of suffocation. Osmond's beautiful mind gave it neither light nor air. Osmond's beautiful mind indeed seemed to peep down from a small, high window and mock at her. This is from page 296 in the Norton edition. Now here you see the elements of the physical setting melding seamlessly to the keynote of characters locked into a conflict that resonates with the novel's great theme of freedom and the sanctity of the human consciousness. Gilbert Osmond's insatiable ego is described in the text as a serpent hidden in a bank of flowers, his worldliness, a sham of surfaces that, I quote from that same page, implied a sovereign contempt for everyone but some 3 or 4 very exalted people whom he envied, and for everything in the world but half a dozen ideas of his own. None of this leaves much room for those attached to his wife, and so Isabel, in a sense, unwittingly sacrifices them to please her husband. As the second half of the novel begins, we find just how negatively Osmond has affected Isabel. On page 242, we learn that she felt herself disjoined from everyone she had ever known before, from her 2 sisters, who wrote to express a dutiful hope that she would be happy, and a surprise, somewhat more vague, at her not having chosen a consort who was the hero of a richer accumulation of anecdote. From Henrietta, who she was sure would come out too late on purpose to remonstrate. From Lord Warburton, who would certainly console himself, and from Caspar Goodwood, who perhaps would not. From her aunt, who had cold, shallow ideas about marriage for which she was not sorry to display her contempt, and from Ralph, whose talk about having great views for her was surely but a whimsical cover for personal disappointment. Strangely, these important figures in the background of Isabel's life were once more prominent, and their waning influence corresponds to their briefer appearances in the second half of the novel. But when you think about it, they also are her history, which the emotional and psychological needs of Gilbert Osmond forces her to put aside, deny, go without. And in this sense, their removal leaves Isabel alone, blanker, less bolstered in her new life by the sustaining provision of a past. Certainly Rome for Americans in 1876 is a lonely place in and of itself. In the early 1870s, Rome was about to be transformed from a papal state in which the Pope reigned supreme as both a spiritual and secular leader to a modern European city or capital where the Vatican was confined to its own sovereign state within the walls of a more encompassing urban environment. It's interesting that at one point early in their acquaintance, Gilbert Osmond reveals an odd desire to be a pope, which strikes me now as congruent with the shrinking sovereignty of the Vatican in the midst of the world's worldliest city. As the city modernized, it drew more international travelers and wealthy American tourists to it. That hadn't been the case a decade earlier, say in the generation of Henry James's parents and their friends. And James himself personally experienced these changes that were occurring in Rome. Rome then was a place for wandering bohemians, art students, sent there by their American teachers, and perhaps religious-minded Americans with enough disposable income to take a tour of St. Peter's Cathedral. James's first novel, as a matter of fact, Roderick Hudson, features just such an American art student. But when James revisited Rome in the early 1870s, he felt that the city had changed. It had become a place of transient tourists, a playground for wealthy Americans who came and went with the changing seasons. Unlike these American tourists who eventually returned home to the United States, Isabel Archer is among the relatively small number to relocate to Rome more permanently. She's a member of an exclusive expatriate community, in other words. And as a settler, she does not mix with Italian society, as evidenced both by the text and by what we know about American expatriates there. Few of them bothered even to learn the language or practice the local customs or explore the culture. They tended to associate with other small communities or colonies of Americans or English travelers and other expats. They conducted any necessary business with a select number of English or German shopkeepers. And it has been estimated that in a total Roman population of 250,000 people in the year 1871, 457 of them were permanently resident Protestants. This small number has within it an even smaller number of American-born residents. And this isolation, this social claustrophobia, and multiple layers of inaccessible history has a crushing effect on Isabel Archer's sense of personal and even national freedom. And I want to make a few more observations about Rome before moving on to other aspects of the book. And they are variations on the theme of history that we've been discussing. Let me begin with a rather eerie description of Isabel seated in the Capitoline Museum among the ancient Greek statues that are collected there in Rome. It constitutes a spatial interlude in the text, a kind of pause that is also an in-between time. It's not a very long time, as it turns out, but just long enough to retain a sense of Lord Warburton's departure just a moment before, and the anticipation of Gilbert Osmond about to enter the gallery. Isabel at this point is not engaged to Osmond, remember, and James writes on page 212, and I'm quoting here, "They shook hands, and he, Warburton, left her alone in the glorious room among the shining antique marbles. She sat down in the center of the circle of these presences, regarding them vaguely, resting her eyes on their beautiful blank faces, listening, as it were, to their eternal silence. It is impossible in Rome, at least, to look long at a great company of Greek sculptures without feeling the effect of their noble quietude, which, as with a high door closed for the ceremony, slowly drops on the spirit the large white mantle of peace. I say in Rome especially because the Roman air is an exquisite medium for such impressions. The golden sunshine mingles with them. The deep stillness of the past, so vivid yet, though it is nothing but a void of names, seems to throw a solemn spell upon them," end quote. And as Gilbert moves quietly into this scene, expecting to find Isabel with Lord Warburton, he sees her sitting alone and asks, "I thought you had company." She answers, "So I have, the best," as she glances at the Antinous and the Faun statues. The passage moves us in a number of directions at once. The alienating beauty of the silent statues nevertheless provide this lone young woman with company, and the best company at that. If, as I've been emphasizing, Rome represents the landscape of human history, that also means that layer upon layer, century upon century, it has been the record of human emotion and experience. Between its ruins and its preserved treasures, such as these sculptures, its failures and its achievements as a civilization, Rome has also figured prominently in English and American literature of the 19th century. It is the setting of Dorothea Brooke's marriage journey in George Eliot's Middlemarch. It is the inspiration for the poetry of Robert Browning and Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And as the allusion to the faun suggests, the setting of James's great American predecessor, Nathaniel Hawthorne's novel, The Marble Faun. Rome, to put this another way, contains and presents to the eye the vastness and the exhaustion of what civilization can express about collective and personal experience. Every aspect of human emotion finds some material form or representation here. So in a sense, for an American of great perception and imagination like Isabel Archer, it can free one from freedom itself. That is, the freedom from what one imagines freedom to be, the confrontation with the smallness of one's own experience, one's capacity to know and feel and express anything beyond what's been said and done innumerable times before. The best one can do is put oneself into some relation with this overwhelming evidence of things known and felt, make company with it, as it were. So again, paradoxically, there is a radical diminution of the self that is also potentially a compensatory and deeply satisfying augmentation of the self that is augmented by the beauty that it faces in the things, the artifacts of culture that it sees. Along with the shifts forward in time and the changed setting of the second half of the novel, we should keep in mind how these adjustments fit themselves to amplifying changes in the character of Isabel Archer herself. I'm referring particularly to the Isabel we meet after 3 years of marriage to Gilbert Osmond. By changes, I don't mean anything dramatically altered in Isabel's physical makeup or anything markedly different. Ned Rosier puts it best when the narrator channels his first impressions of Isabel after not seeing her for several years. On pages 254 and 255, we get this. The years had touched her only to enrich her. The flowers of her youth had not faded. It only hung more quietly on its stem. She had lost something of that quick eagerness to which her husband had privately taken exception. She had more the air of being able to wait. Now, at all events, framed in the gilded doorway, she struck our young man as the picture of a gracious lady. As you can see from the way James frames this image, the changes constitute modifications of Isabel's portrait, a settling of certain aspects, a gentle rubbing out of others, a barely perceptible stillness has come over her, and a slight deepening of hues and colors. Of course, her maturity is set into relief by the slight shift in focus to Pansy, who is about 19 years old at this time, as well as by the way James filters these impressions of her through the perceptions of an ardent young man like Ned Rosier. But even more than this analogy to portraiture are the very nature of Isabel's alterations. They are rendered by James as modifications in Isabel's vocal inflections, the tone she adopts in using language, and changes, you might say, in attitude or outlook. In discussing Ned Rosier's interest in Pansy with Madame Merle, for instance, we get a sense of her growing impatience with that lady's carefully composed inquiries and innuendos when the narrator says of Isabel, and I'm quoting here, her humor had lately turned a good deal to sarcasm, but in a moment she was ashamed of exercising it on so innocent an object as Pansy's suitor. He's very kind, very honest, she presently added, and he's not such a fool as he seems. This is from page 283, incidentally. You can see here in one sentence the effect her life with Osmond has had on her. The growing skepticism, for instance, the slight indication of cruelty in her choice of sarcasm, but the pullback in the second part of her comments to a more genuine, still active consciousness of wanting to be her best possible self. A few pages later, the narrator tells us, it may seem to the reader that Mrs. Osmond had grown of a sudden strangely cynical, for she ended by saying to herself that this difficulty could probably be arranged. That's on page 287. And later this, covert observation had become a habit with her, an instinct of which it is not an exaggeration to say that it was allied to that of self-defense, had made it habitual. She wished as much as possible to know Gilbert's thoughts, to know what he would say beforehand, so that she might prepare her answer. Preparing answers had not been her strong point of old. She had rarely, in this respect, got further than thinking afterwards of clever things she might have said. That's on page 288. The spontaneity has been tempered, and Isabel has become more circumspect, more calculating, as it were, in her interactions with other people. We might understand this to be a defense, certainly, but it's also a sign of socialization. And it's not just language, but actions as well. You'll note that just before the narrator makes these comments, Isabel has almost unconsciously thwarted Gilbert's hopes of securing Lord Warburton for a son-in-law, ruining his dream of acquisition by such a harmless looking act of lingering 15 minutes longer with Pansy and Lord Warburton, so there is no opportunity for them to be alone for an exchange of intimacy or for a marriage proposal to be made before Warburton's departure from Rome. Something held her, says the narrator, leaving us to gather that Isabel's instincts have not quite come to full consciousness at this point. But when they finally do, she realizes immediately that Warburton's interest in Pansy is a less than sincere ploy to be as close to Isabel as possible, to render these lags of recognition and the way the unconscious tends to enact what we can only know later is one of James's most exquisite dramatic devices, one that comes to its fuller expression in chapter 42. It is Ralph, however, who registers for us the full scope of Isabel's changes. And this is appropriate because he's observed her with an all-absorbing interest for longer than any other character in her orbit. In reading these impressions, it might be easy to mistake them for those of the narrator or for the author, for that matter. But again, everything about Isabel Archer is mediated, filtered, and shaped by either those around her or by herself. In the following instance, Ralph's assessment of Isabel tells us much about him as it does about her. On page 272, we have this. Certainly, she had fallen into exaggerations She who used to care so much for the pure truth. And whereas of old she had a great delight in good-humored argument, in intellectual play, she never looked so charming as when in the genial heat of discussion she received a crushing blow full in the face and brushed it away as a feather. She appeared now to think there was nothing worth people's either differing about or agreeing upon. Of old she had been curious, and now she was indifferent. And yet, in spite of her indifference, her activity was greater than ever. Slender still, but lovelier than before, she had gained no great maturity of aspect, yet there was an amplitude and a brilliancy in her personal arrangements that gave a touch of insolence to her beauty. Poor human-hearted Isabel, what perversity had bitten her? Her light step drew a massive drapery behind it. Her intelligent head sustained a majesty of ornament. The free, keen girl had become quite another person. What he saw was the fine lady who was supposed to represent something. What did Isabel represent? Ralph asked himself, and he could only answer by saying that she represented Gilbert Osmond. Good heavens, what a function, he then woefully exclaimed. He was lost in wonder at the mystery of things. Thus far, I've been emphasizing the differences between volumes 1 and volume 2 of this long novel. Now, given its span, the question of cohesion and continuity comes in as an aesthetic, structural, and thematic problem for any writer. So now I'd like to turn to this aspect of the novel and point out some possible ways of grasping how James confronts these artistic issues. Although he had tremendous admiration for novelists like George Eliot, who came immediately before him, his acknowledgement of her literary genius did not keep him from describing books like Middlemarch as loose, baggy monsters. There are many possible ways to detect the unity of James's Portrait of a Lady, even on the level of style alone. I'll point out, however, some of the book's deeper structural elements that bridge its two different halves. When readers read the first sentence of chapter 36 in volume 2, it may seem that the novel is in a way beginning all over again. I quote, "One afternoon of the autumn of 1876, toward dusk, a young man of pleasing appearance rang at the door of a small apartment on the third floor of an old Roman house." Now, that young man, of course, is Ned or Edward Rosier, a name we heard briefly in volume 1, and he has come to appeal to a character we have met and come to know fairly well, Madame Merle. But unlike our first glimpse of that lady, seated playing a piano across the far end of a large, well-appointed music room at the country house of Garden Court, we find her this time in rather shabby, reduced circumstances. Has this always been the case? We have always only seen her in other people's grander homes. Perhaps as the novel rounds the bend to its conclusion, we will see, as Isabel finally sees, the real Serena Merle and the extent of her desire to have more. As of Rosier, his pursuit of Pansy Osmond echoes both Casper's and Lord Warburton's desire to marry Isabel in the first half of the book. Oddly enough, this romantic subplot is joined to the more general history of Isabel Archer by the fact that Ned's competing suitor for Pansy's hand is none other than Lord Warburton himself, another indication of his displaced ongoing desire to be nearer to the now married Mrs. Osmond. As for Pansy, She now has two mother figures vying for her affection and influencing her destiny. In a stroke of irony, Madame Merle has succeeded in securing great wealth for Pansy's dowry by bringing Isabel to the attention of Gilbert Osmond, but has failed in creating a confidant for her biological daughter who advocates for Ned Rosier, a far less prestigious suitor, but one who genuinely cares for Pansy. I'd also note that this thread of the narrative is picked up in autumn at dusk, whereas the book opens in summer in the afternoon. Ned shares with Madame Merle also the flaw that prevented Osmond from marrying her. She's not rich enough. When Ned Rosier first visits Mrs. Osmond at her Roman palazzo, Isabel Archer, as you may recall, emerges into the scene much the same way she appeared at Garden Court, coming out of a deep doorway or framework. James structures the events and situations of Volume 2 as rhymes, in a way, echoes, circling back to similar events, but in an altered way. And we can find many particular examples of this in the book. But the real question goes beyond structure to include ideas about the past's hold on the present. And these are ideas that we'll take up when we reconvene on Wednesday.